Let's get right into it. The Tucker Telephone. Deep in the dense forests of Arkansas, there once stood a prison that housed some of America's most dangerous criminals. But within its cold iron walls, the real monsters weren't the inmates. Welcome to Tucker Prison, a name that struck fear into anyone who had the misfortune of being locked up there. It wasn't just a prison, it was hell on earth, where guards had free rein to dish out sadistic punishments under the guise of maintaining order. And among their cruelest tools was something that survivors would never forget: the Tucker telephone. At first glance, it looked like an ordinary, old-fashioned rotary phone. But this device wasn't for making calls. It was for turning human beings into breathing corpses. Whenever a prisoner stepped out of line, refused an order, or simply got on the wrong side of a guard, they were dragged into the torture room. Electrodes were attached to two parts of the body, one on the toe and the other on the genitals. Then, with the simple crank of the handle, a jolt of electricity surged through their nervous system, triggering violent muscle spasms, irregular heartbeats, and unbearable pain coursing through every inch of their body. One crank, a scream of pure agony. Two cranks? It felt like their insides were being set on fire. Three cranks? Consciousness began to fade, their bodies convulsing uncontrollably as terror seeped deep into their bones. And for those who still wouldn't break, well, they were given a long-distance call. A long-distance call meant a prolonged, intensified shock, one that twisted their minds, shattered their perception of reality, and left them writhing in a nightmarish blend of pain and insanity. Some prisoners passed out from the sheer torment, but for those who survived, the nightmare was far from over. Many were left with permanent nerve damage, infertility, and uncontrollable muscle spasms for the rest of their lives. Meanwhile, the guards, they laughed, they enjoyed it, they made the calls, and the prisoners were the receivers of pure suffering. In 1970, the horrific truth about the Tucker telephone came to light during an investigation into prisoner abuse. Those responsible were brought to justice, and prison reforms followed. But was justice truly served? The Tucker telephone may be gone, but the fear it created still lingers. History has shown that cruelty can be hidden, buried, and denied, but it never truly disappears. Who knows where similar methods of inhumane torture are still being used today? In the darkest corners of the world, there are still places where humans are nothing more than tools for those who crave power and control. Number 2. Schwedentrunk. In 1630, Europe was ablaze. The 30 Years' War wasn't just a battle between kingdoms. It was a blood-soaked massacre, a time when human suffering reached unimaginable depths. When the Swedish army stormed through Germany, they didn't just conquer and kill. They brought with them a method of torture so brutal that victims would beg for death. This horrific punishment was known as Schwedentrunk, the Swedish drink. Under the damp, moldy ceiling, the dim glow of torches flickered. The air was thick, reeking of blood and sweat. A German prisoner, hands bound behind his back, was forced to tilt his head backward. Swedish soldiers stood around him, their faces expressionless, each holding buckets filled with something that no one in their right mind would call water. "Drink up, you filthy scum!" A soldier poured the contents down his throat. A foul mix of dirty water, strong liquor, urine, and even human waste, all blended into one disgusting concoction. The prisoner gagged, but rough hands gripped his jaw tightly, forcing him to swallow. His stomach twisted violently, his insides churning and rebelling against the poison he was being fed. But the tormentors didn't stop. They kept pouring, and pouring, and pouring. His belly swelled like a balloon. His skin stretched so tightly that one wrong move could make it burst. But the worst part was yet to come. One soldier stepped forward, grinning with sadistic delight, before suddenly delivering a brutal kick to the prisoner's stomach. Gah! A vile mixture of filth and liquid spewed from his mouth and nose, burning his throat and filling the air with a gut-wrenching stench. His body convulsed on the floor, his guts feeling like they were tearing apart, his head spinning in sheer agony. And the most terrifying part? He was still alive. The soldiers laughed, kicking him around like a rag doll. The game wasn't over yet. Not everyone was lucky enough to die right away. Those who survived were left with ruptured stomachs, shredded intestines, and digestive systems so damaged that death became a slow, inevitable process. Schwedentrunk wasn't just torture. It was a complete destruction from within, turning the victim's own body into a living coffin. War doesn't just kill people on the battlefield. It turns the victors into monsters. Sometimes the scariest thing isn't death, but what humans are capable of doing to each other before it happens. Number 3. The breaking wheel. Paris, June 1654. François Lemoine, a small-time street thief, was caught red-handed while trying to escape a botched robbery. But what he didn't know was that his crime wasn't just seen as petty theft. It was a death sentence. A sentence carried out in one of the most gruesome ways imaginable. They called it the breaking wheel. François was dragged to the town square where a massive wooden wheel lay tilted on the ground. The executioner, a towering man with an expression as cold as steel, tied François to the wheel, stretching out his limbs so that each joint was fully exposed under the scorching sun. The crowd roared. Justice, punishment, execution. Then the executioner raised a heavy iron hammer and brought it crashing down. Crack! The sickening sound of splintering bone echoed through the square. François' arm bent at a grotesque angle. Crack! His left leg twisted backward like a broken tree branch. A third strike, a fourth, a fifth. But he was still alive. At this point, François' body no longer felt like his own. His bones were shattered, his limbs reduced to nothing more than broken sticks of flesh. Yet he was still conscious. He could still feel every single pulse of agony. But his punishment wasn't over yet. The wheel was lifted and mounted onto a tall post, and there he remained, suspended in midair, broken but still breathing. For 2 full days he hung there under the merciless sun, his shattered frame on display for all to see. No water, no food, just pain. And time, slowly crushing his will to live. On the 3rd day, François took his final breath. But his body remained on the wheel for another week, left to rot as a warning to anyone who dared to defy the law. For over 500 years, thousands of people met their end beneath the breaking wheel. Their bodies twisted, crushed, and discarded like nothing more than mere entertainment. Once upon a time, people flocked to the town square to watch these executions like a public spectacle. To them, justice wasn't just served, it was put on display. Number 4. The Coffin Torture. The Middle Ages, a time when justice was as cruel as the crimes themselves. And among the most dreaded punishments was one so horrific that even witnessing it could send chills down your spine. The Coffin Torture. The victims? Heretics. Traitors. Or simply, those who angered the wrong people in power. Their punishment? They were locked inside an iron cage, one shaped exactly like a human body, so tight that movement was nearly impossible. If they were lucky, they could stand upright. If not, they would be forced into a twisted, agonizing position, unable to move for days. The cage was hoisted into the air, left dangling in the town square, completely exposed to the elements. Scorching sun, freezing rain, no food, no water, no one to save them. But that wasn't even the worst part. The crows. The black-winged reapers would come in swarms, circling like a sinister omen. They waited. They watched for weakness. And when the victim could no longer fight back, they struck, piece by piece, bit by bit. Flesh was torn from the body, slowly, methodically, until all that remained was a lifeless skeleton swaying in the iron cage. A death dragged out for days where the pain wasn't just physical, but psychological. The townspeople? They walked past, heads down, avoiding the hollow, lifeless stare of the victim's empty eye sockets. To the authorities, it was a warning. To the people, it was an unshakable nightmare. Number 5. The saw torture. The saw torture, one of the most gruesome execution methods in medieval Europe and the Middle East. The usual victims? Heretics. Traitors? Adulterers. Dragged to the execution site, the condemned were bound at the ankles and hung upside down, their heads dangling just above the ground. The executioner stood nearby, gripping a massive, razor-sharp iron saw. But why upside down? Because blood rushing to the brain kept the victim conscious longer. That meant they would feel every single cut, every inch of flesh tearing apart, every jolt of pain searing through their body. The executioners began by sawing between the legs. The first cut, skin ripped open. Blood poured out. The jagged teeth of the saw tore through muscle, grinding against bone. Each stroke sent waves of indescribable agony through the victim's body. Bones cracked. Breaths came in short, panicked gasps. The air filled with muffled screams, strangled by sheer, unbearable pain. And the executioners? They took their time, cutting slowly, methodically, making sure the torture lasted as long as possible. But here's the most terrifying part. A victim could remain alive until the saw reached their chest, their brain fully alert. their nerves still screaming. They would feel every single stroke until finally the body could take no more. Some historical accounts claim that Saint Simon Zelotes, one of Jesus' 12 apostles, was executed this way. But what's even more disturbing, the saw torture didn't end with the Middle Ages. Records suggest that certain extremist groups in the modern era have used this method to punish their enemies. It may not be seen in public anymore, but history has proven one thing. When humans want to hurt each other, they will always find the cruelest ways imaginable. Because history isn't just stories of progress and civilization, it's also filled with unspeakable cruelty. Now imagine, if you had lived in that era, could you stomach watching something like this unfold right before your eyes? Number 6. Bamboo. Torture Southeast Asia and Imperial China. When a death sentence was issued, there was a method so terrifying that it turned a simple plant into an instrument of pure horror. No knives, no fire, just bamboo. Sounds harmless, right? But just wait. Imagine this. You are tied down onto a wooden frame. Below you, nothing but a patch of young bamboo shoots. At first, nothing happens. You feel the chill of the night air. You hear the rustling of leaves. You smell the damp earth beneath you. But here's a little-known fact. Bamboo grows over 10 centimeters per day, which means if something is in its way, it won't stop. It will push through, tear through, keep growing. At first, the victim felt nothing. But after 12 hours, the first sharp point of bamboo pierced through the skin. After 24 hours, the bamboo was deep in the muscle, slicing through nerves, sending waves of excruciating pain through the body. After 48 hours, the stalks were strong enough to puncture organs. The intestines, the liver, the lungs, one by one, cut apart from the inside. But death would not come quickly. The victims lingered for days, trapped in unimaginable agony as the bamboo slowly, mercilessly pierced deeper, deeper, deeper. They couldn't scream. They couldn't beg for mercy. They could only lie there, eyes wide open, feeling every single moment until their body finally gave out. One of the slowest, most horrifying deaths in human history. Some Western sources claim that the Japanese military used this method during World War II, but there is no official evidence to confirm it. No historical records fully prove that it happened. So, was it real? Or just another hidden horror buried in the depths of history? At this point, the answer may not even matter. Because one thing is for certain. We never want to see something like this happen again. Number 7. White Room Torture. White Room Torture. A psychological torment so devastating that it's been used in some of the world's most secretive prisons, from CIA black sites to the most inhumane detention centers. No bruises, no whips, no blades. Yet it can break a person's mind, erase their identity, and destroy them in ways even physical torture cannot. The victim is locked inside a completely white room. White walls, white floors, white ceiling, no windows, no clocks, no sense of time. The lights, blinding white, are on 24/7, never dimming, stripping the victim of any awareness of day or night. No sounds, no voices, just pure, absolute silence. Even the food, white, tasteless, odorless. Nothing but emptiness. And themselves. And then, the mind begins to turn against itself. With no time markers, no reality anchors, the brain starts hallucinating. Voices whisper in their head, but no one is speaking. Shadows flicker in the corner of their vision, but no one is there. Days, weeks, months, the victim loses all sense of time. They start questioning their own existence. No one leaves the white room intact. Even after being released, they struggle to reconnect with reality. A single day could feel like an eternity, or vanish in a blink. Some never recover. Their brains completely shattered. No blood, no beatings, no physical wounds. Just a room. But that's all it takes to break even the strongest minds. Now the real question is, how long do you think you'd last in the white room? Number 8. The lead sprinkler. The lead sprinkler. One of the most horrific torture devices ever created by mankind. At first glance, it looks harmless, like an ordinary watering can. But instead of water, it holds molten lead, boiling oil, or searing hot tar. And how was it used? Simple. Terrifying. The scalding liquid was slowly drizzled over the victim's body. Their flesh sizzled. The stench of burning skin filled the air. And the screams? They ripped through the silence like a death cry. Those accused of heresy, witchcraft, or treason were tied to a wooden chair, unable to move. The executioner lifted the lead sprinkler, and poured the molten agony onto their back. Their skin blistered, curled, and peeled away. But the worst part? The boiling metal was then poured into their eyes, a single drop, and their sight was gone forever. Their eyeballs melted, their face charred beyond recognition. And for the final act, the executioner forced their mouth open and poured molten lead down their throat. The 300-degree liquid burned through their tongue, throat, and windpipe. No screams, no begging, only the sickening sound of bubbling flesh as the metal seared through their insides. Some died instantly. Some lived long enough to feel their organs slowly liquefy. The lucky ones? They were left blind, disfigured, and permanently crippled, a walking testament to human cruelty. The lead sprinkler was used until the 17th century. Then it disappeared. But the terror it left behind? That never faded. And that's just a small glimpse of history's darkest punishments. What do you think about these brutal torture methods? Let us know in the comments, and if you found this video interesting, don't forget to drop a like and subscribe. Thanks for watching.